Question 1. Strategic planning requires a real estate salesperson in Boise, Idaho, to consider ethical implications. If a salesperson is representing a seller and learns during a confidential conversation that the seller's absolute lowest acceptable price is $300,000, and shortly thereafter, a potential buyer expresses interest and asks the salesperson for advice on how much to offer, what is the most ethically and legally sound course of action for the salesperson to take? Option A. Advise the potential buyer to offer $300,000 as this is the seller's stated minimum to ensure a quick sale. Option B. Immediately inform both the seller and the potential buyer, and their respective brokers if applicable, about the potential conflict of interest and the information learned, recommending that the buyer seek independent advice or representation. Option C. Withdraw from representing the seller without explaining the specific reason for withdrawal, citing a conflict of interest. Option D. Discreetly inform the potential buyer of the seller's absolute lowest price without mentioning the confidential conversation. The correct answer is B. Immediately inform both the seller and the potential buyer, and their respective brokers if applicable, about the potential conflict of interest and the information learned, recommending that the buyer seek independent advice or representation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a potential conflict of interest and the obligation to maintain client confidentiality while also adhering to ethical disclosure requirements. The salesperson is privy to sensitive information about both the seller and a potential buyer, creating a delicate balance between loyalty to their client and fairness to all parties involved. Idaho real estate law and professional ethics demand transparency and avoidance of situations that could compromise trust or lead to unfair advantage. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves immediately disclosing the potential conflict of interest to both parties and their respective brokers. This approach upholds the principle of informed consent and ensures that all parties are aware of the situation and can make decisions accordingly. Idaho Real Estate Commission rules emphasize honesty, integrity, and the avoidance of misrepresentation. By disclosing the dual agency situation and the information learned from the seller, the salesperson acts ethically and in compliance with regulations that require agents to act in the best interests of their clients, while also being truthful and fair to all parties in a transaction. This proactive disclosure prevents any appearance of impropriety and allows for a structured resolution, such as one party choosing to seek independent representation. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the transaction without disclosing the information learned from the seller to the potential buyer. This failure to disclose violates the duty of honesty and fair dealing owed to all parties in a real estate transaction, as mandated by Idaho law. It creates a significant conflict of interest and could lead to accusations of misrepresentation or acting in bad faith, potentially resulting in disciplinary action from the Idaho Real Estate Commission. Another incorrect approach is to inform the potential buyer of the seller's bottom line without the seller's explicit consent. This breaches the duty of confidentiality owed to the seller, a core ethical principle and a requirement under Idaho real estate regulations. Revealing confidential information can damage the agent-client relationship and lead to legal repercussions and professional sanctions. A third incorrect approach is to withdraw from representing the seller without informing them of the potential buyer's interest and the conflict. While withdrawing might seem like a way to avoid the conflict, it is unprofessional and potentially harmful if not handled with proper communication. The seller deserves to be informed about potential opportunities and the reasons for the agent's withdrawal, allowing them to make informed decisions about their property sale. This failure to communicate transparently also undermines the professional standard of care. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such ethical dilemmas should utilize a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, client welfare, and regulatory compliance. This involves identifying the ethical issue, gathering relevant facts, considering all stakeholders' interests, evaluating potential courses of action against ethical principles and legal requirements, and then choosing and implementing the most responsible option. In real estate, this often means erring on the side of over-disclosure when conflicts arise, ensuring all parties have the necessary information to proceed ethically and legally. Question 2. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a developer client in Boise, Idaho, could significantly increase their short-term profit by rapidly acquiring multiple residential properties in a specific neighborhood, potentially driving up local property values quickly. However, this aggressive acquisition strategy might also lead to community backlash and could destabilize the local housing market, making future development more challenging. What is the most ethically and professionally responsible course of action for an Idaho real estate salesperson advising this client? Option A. Inform the client that market speculation is beyond the scope of their role and proceed with the transaction as requested, without offering further guidance on market implications. Option B. Recommend that the client abandon the investment entirely due to the potential for negative market reactions, without exploring any mitigating strategies or alternative approaches. Option C. Advise the client on the potential negative impacts of their aggressive acquisition strategy on the local real estate market and community, and explore alternative strategies that balance profit with market stability. Option D. Encourage the client to proceed with the rapid acquisition strategy, focusing solely on maximizing their immediate financial gains and downplaying any potential market concerns. Correct answer is C. Advise the client on the potential negative impacts of their aggressive acquisition strategy on the local real estate market and community, and explore alternative strategies that balance profit with market stability. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate salesperson in Idaho to balance the immediate financial interests of their client with the broader, long-term economic health of the local market, while adhering to Idaho's specific real estate regulations and ethical standards. The salesperson must exercise sound judgment to avoid actions that could be perceived as predatory or detrimental to the community, even if they appear beneficial to a single client in the short term. The best professional approach involves advising the client on the potential negative impacts of their proposed actions on the local real estate market. This includes explaining how a rapid, aggressive acquisition strategy could artificially inflate prices, deter future investment, and potentially lead to a market downturn that ultimately harms all property owners, including the client. This approach aligns with the ethical duty of a real estate professional to act with honesty, integrity, and in a manner that promotes the best interests of the public, as outlined by the Idaho Real Estate Commission's rules and the National Association of Realtors Registered Code of Ethics, which Idaho licensees are often expected to uphold. It prioritizes informed decision-making and responsible market participation. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on maximizing the client's immediate profit without considering the wider market implications. This might involve actively encouraging the client to proceed with aggressive tactics, potentially even suggesting ways to circumvent local concerns or community sentiment. Such an approach fails to uphold the salesperson's ethical obligations to the public and could violate Idaho's real estate laws that prohibit deceptive practices or actions that harm the market. It demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and foresight. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's concerns about market impact and proceed with the transaction as planned, without offering any guidance or counsel on the potential consequences. This passive stance abdicates the salesperson's responsibility to provide expert advice and could lead to unintended negative outcomes for the client and the community. It suggests a lack of understanding of the interconnectedness of real estate transactions and market dynamics, and a failure to act in the client's best overall interest, which includes protecting them from potential future market instability. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to advise the client to abandon the investment altogether due to potential market concerns, without exploring alternative strategies or providing a balanced perspective. While caution is important, a complete withdrawal without further analysis or discussion of mitigation strategies might be premature and could deprive the client of a potentially sound investment opportunity. A professional should aim to guide the client through complex market considerations, not simply shut down possibilities without thorough exploration. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Thoroughly understanding the client's objectives. 2. Analyzing the potential economic and market impacts of the proposed actions within the specific context of the Idaho real estate market. 3. Clearly communicating these potential impacts to the client, outlining both benefits and risks. 4. Advising on strategies that align with the client's goals while mitigating negative market consequences. 5. ensuring all advice and actions comply with Idaho real estate laws and ethical standards. Question 3. The efficiency study reveals that a real estate salesperson in Idaho, who is representing a buyer in a transaction, discovers that the seller of the property is their sibling. The salesperson has not previously disclosed this familial relationship to the buyer. What is the most ethical and legally compliant course of action for the salesperson to take immediately upon this discovery? Option A. Immediately disclose the familial relationship to the buyer in writing. Explain the potential conflict of interest and obtain the buyer's informed written consent to continue representing them in this transaction. Option B. Proceed with the transaction, assuming the buyer will eventually discover the relationship and that it will not impact their decision. Option C. Continue to represent the buyer without any disclosure, as the salesperson's primary duty is to secure the best possible deal for the buyer, and the relationship is a personal matter. Option D. Verbally inform the buyer of the relationship during the next scheduled meeting, but do not put it in writing. Correct answer is A. Immediately disclose the familial relationship to the buyer in writing, explain the potential conflict of interest, and obtain the buyer's informed written consent to continue representing them in this transaction. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate salesperson in Idaho to navigate a potential conflict of interest while upholding their fiduciary duties to their client. The salesperson must balance their personal financial gain with their obligation to act in the best interest of the buyer. Careful judgment is required to ensure transparency and avoid any appearance of impropriety, which could lead to disciplinary action by the Idaho Real Estate Commission. The best professional approach involves full disclosure and obtaining informed consent from the client before proceeding. This means clearly informing the buyer in writing about the salesperson's familial relationship with the seller and the potential for a dual agency situation if the salesperson intends to represent both parties. The salesperson must then obtain the buyer's explicit written consent to proceed with the transaction, understanding that the salesperson may have divided loyalties. This approach aligns with Idaho's real estate license law and ethical standards, which mandate honesty, integrity, and the avoidance of misrepresentation or concealment of material facts. It prioritizes the client's interests and ensures compliance with disclosure requirements. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the transaction without disclosing the familial relationship to the buyer. This failure to disclose a material fact, which could influence the buyer's decision-making, violates the salesperson's duty of honesty and integrity, and is a direct contravention of Idaho Real Estate Commission rules regarding disclosure and conflicts of interest. Another incorrect approach would be to only verbally inform the buyer about the relationship. While better than no disclosure, verbal disclosure alone is insufficient under Idaho law and professional standards. Written disclosure and consent are required to create a clear record and ensure the client fully comprehends the implications of the situation. This lack of written documentation leaves both the client and the salesperson vulnerable. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to assume the buyer is aware of the relationship due to a prior casual conversation. Real estate transactions involve significant financial commitments, and assumptions about a client's knowledge are dangerous. The salesperson has an affirmative duty to ensure the buyer is fully informed in writing about any potential conflicts of interest that could affect the transaction. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency and client protection. This involves identifying potential conflicts of interest early, understanding the specific disclosure requirements under Idaho law, documenting all communications and agreements in writing, and always acting with the client's best interests as the paramount concern. When in doubt, seeking guidance from a supervising broker or the Idaho Real Estate Commission is advisable. Question 4. Governance review demonstrates that a real estate salesperson in Idaho is reviewing a commercial lease agreement for a retail space. The lease stipulates a fixed monthly rent payment from the tenant. The tenant is also explicitly responsible for paying for their own utilities, such as electricity and water. The landlord, according to the lease, is responsible for all other property operating expenses, including property taxes, building insurance, and routine maintenance of the common areas and the building structure. Based on these terms, how should the salesperson best classify this lease agreement? Option A. This lease agreement is best classified as a net lease because the tenant is responsible for paying for their own utilities. Option B. The lease term length is the primary factor in determining its classification as gross or net. Option C. This lease agreement is best classified as a modified gross lease because the tenant has some responsibilities beyond the base rent. Option D. This lease agreement is best classified as a gross lease because the tenant's fixed rent payment covers the majority of the property's operating expenses, with the tenant only being responsible for their direct utility consumption. Correct answer is D. This lease agreement is best classified as a gross lease because the tenant's fixed rent payment covers the majority of the property's operating expenses, with the tenant only being responsible for their direct utility consumption. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate salesperson in Idaho to navigate the nuances of lease agreements, specifically distinguishing between a gross lease and a net lease, and understanding the implications of each for both the landlord and the tenant. Misinterpreting these terms can lead to contractual disputes, financial losses, and damage to the salesperson's professional reputation and brokerage. The salesperson must demonstrate a thorough understanding of common lease structures and their typical provisions to provide accurate advice and draft compliant agreements. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves clearly identifying the lease type by examining the allocation of operating expenses. A gross lease typically includes all operating expenses, such as property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, within the fixed rental payment. A net lease, conversely, requires the tenant to pay some or all of these operating expenses in addition to the base rent. Therefore, the approach that correctly identifies the lease as a gross lease, because the tenant's payment covers all these expenses, is the most accurate and professionally sound. This aligns with standard real estate practices and the fundamental definitions of lease types, ensuring clarity and preventing future misunderstandings. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to assume the lease is a net lease simply because the tenant is responsible for utilities. While tenants often pay for utilities in both gross and net leases, this single responsibility does not define the lease type. The core distinction lies in the allocation of property taxes, insurance, and major maintenance, which are typically landlord responsibilities in a gross lease. Misclassifying it as a net lease based solely on utility responsibility would be a significant error. Another incorrect approach would be to conclude it is a modified gross lease without sufficient evidence. A modified gross lease involves a hybrid arrangement where some expenses are shared or passed through, but the specific terms must be clearly defined. Without explicit details about which expenses are shared or passed through beyond utilities, labeling it as modified gross is speculative and lacks the precision required for accurate lease classification. A further incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the lease term length. While lease terms can vary, the duration of the lease does not determine whether it is a gross or net lease. The classification is based on the financial responsibilities for operating expenses, not the time period of the agreement. This approach demonstrates a misunderstanding of the fundamental characteristics that differentiate lease types. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the core financial obligations outlined in the lease agreement. This involves 1. Carefully reviewing the lease document to identify all tenant and landlord responsibilities, particularly concerning property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. 2. Comparing these responsibilities against the definitions of common lease types, gross, net, modified gross. 3. Consulting Idaho real estate law and established industry practices for clarification if any ambiguity exists. 4. Seeking guidance from their supervising broker when encountering complex or unusual lease provisions. Question 5. The risk matrix shows a potential client in Boise, Idaho, is interested in purchasing a property with the intention of operating a small home-based catering business. The licensee is aware that the property is in a residential zone, but has not personally verified the specific home occupation regulations. What is the most professional and legally compliant approach for the Idaho real estate licensee to take? Option A. Rely on the fact that other homes in the neighborhood appear to be used for similar small business activities to conclude that a catering business is likely permitted. Option B. Assume that since the property is in a residential zone, any home-based business is permissible as long as it does not significantly disturb neighbors. Option C. Advise the client that operating a home-based catering business may be subject to specific home occupation regulations within Boise's residential zoning, and recommend they consult the City of Boise Planning and Development Services for detailed information and any necessary permits. Option D. Inform the client that zoning is a complex issue, and they should consult with a real estate attorney to determine the feasibility of their business idea. The correct answer is C. Advise the client that operating a home-based catering business may be subject to specific home occupation regulations within Boise's residential zoning, and recommend they consult the City of Boise Planning and Development Services for detailed information and any necessary permits. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because real estate licensees in Idaho are expected to possess a foundational understanding of local zoning laws and land use regulations to effectively advise clients and avoid misrepresentation. Failure to do so can lead to significant legal and ethical repercussions for both the client and the licensee. The challenge lies in balancing the client's immediate desires with the legal constraints of the property. The best professional practice involves proactively researching and understanding the applicable zoning ordinances for the property in question. This approach requires the licensee to consult official city or county planning department resources, review zoning maps, and understand the specific regulations pertaining to the property's parcel. By doing so, the licensee can accurately inform the client about potential uses, restrictions, and any necessary steps for variances or rezoning. This aligns with the Idaho real estate license law's requirement for licensees to act with honesty, integrity, and competence, which includes having knowledge of relevant laws affecting real property. Ethically, it demonstrates a commitment to client welfare by preventing them from making uninformed decisions based on inaccurate or incomplete information. An incorrect approach involves making assumptions about zoning based on the property's current use or neighborhood appearance. This is professionally unacceptable because current use does not guarantee future permissibility, and neighborhood characteristics can be misleading. Zoning is a matter of official record, and assumptions can lead to serious misrepresentations, violating the licensee's duty of care and honesty. Another incorrect approach is to simply tell the client that zoning is not their problem or that they should figure it out themselves. This abdicates the licensee's professional responsibility. Licensees are not zoning attorneys. They are expected to provide competent service, which includes identifying potential zoning issues and advising clients to seek expert consultation if necessary. This approach fails to uphold the standard of care and can be seen as a breach of fiduciary duty. A further incorrect approach is to rely solely on informal conversations with neighbors or other agents for zoning information. While informal discussions can sometimes provide context, they are not a substitute for official verification. Zoning regulations are formal legal documents, and informal advice is prone to error, misinterpretation, or outdated information, leading to potential legal liabilities for the licensee and the client. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify the client's goals and intended use of the property. Second, determine the relevant jurisdiction's zoning authority, city or county. Third, consult official zoning ordinances and maps. Fourth, if the intended use appears to conflict with current zoning, advise the client on the process for seeking variances or rezoning and recommend consulting with a legal professional or planning consultant. Finally, document all advice and research conducted. Question 6. Stakeholder feedback indicates that Idaho real estate licensees sometimes struggle to effectively advise sellers on the nuances of different listing agreements. A seller in Boise, Idaho, wants to list their property and is seeking advice on the most appropriate type of listing agreement. They have expressed a desire for broad market exposure, but also want to retain some flexibility in finding a buyer themselves. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible approach for the licensee? Option A. Recommend an exclusive right to sell agreement, emphasizing that it will ensure the property receives the widest possible marketing efforts from the brokerage. Option B. Suggest an open listing agreement, as this will allow the seller to work with multiple agents and potentially find a buyer independently without commission concerns. Option C. Fully explain the differences between an exclusive right to sell, an exclusive agency, and an open listing agreement, detailing the commission obligations and seller rights under each, and then recommend the agreement that best aligns with the seller's stated desire for broad exposure and flexibility. Option D. Present an exclusive agency agreement, highlighting that it offers a balance between broker marketing and seller autonomy, without dwelling on the specific commission exceptions. The correct answer is C. Fully explain the differences between an exclusive right to sell, an exclusive agency, and an open listing agreement, detailing the commission obligations and seller rights under each, and then recommend the agreement that best aligns with the seller's stated desire for broad exposure and flexibility. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because a real estate licensee must navigate the differing contractual obligations and potential liabilities associated with various listing agreement types. The challenge lies in advising a seller on the most appropriate agreement that aligns with their goals, while ensuring full compliance with Idaho real estate law and ethical best practices. Misunderstanding or misrepresenting the implications of each agreement can lead to disputes, financial losses, and disciplinary action. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves thoroughly explaining the fundamental differences between an exclusive right to sell, an exclusive agency, and an open listing agreement to the seller. This includes detailing the commission obligations under each type, the scope of the broker's authority, and the seller's rights and responsibilities. The licensee must then recommend the agreement that best aligns with the seller's stated objectives, such as maximizing exposure versus retaining flexibility, while ensuring the seller fully comprehends the terms before signing. This approach prioritizes informed consent and fiduciary duty, which are cornerstones of Idaho real estate licensing law. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending an exclusive right to sell agreement solely because it guarantees a commission, without fully exploring the seller's preferences or the market conditions, fails to uphold the fiduciary duty to act in the seller's best interest. This could lead to the seller feeling pressured into an agreement that doesn't suit their needs. Suggesting an open listing agreement without clearly explaining that the seller can list with multiple brokers and owe a commission to any who procures a buyer, potentially leading to confusion and disputes over commission entitlement, is also problematic. Presenting an exclusive agency agreement as identical to an exclusive right to sell, omitting the crucial distinction that the seller can find a buyer themselves without owing a commission, misinforms the seller and creates a risk of misunderstanding contractual obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always begin by actively listening to and understanding the client's goals and priorities. This understanding forms the basis for recommending the most suitable contractual framework. A thorough explanation of all available options, including their respective advantages and disadvantages, is essential for informed decision-making. Licensees must then guide the client towards the option that best meets their stated objectives, ensuring transparency and full disclosure at every step, in strict adherence to Idaho's real estate regulations and ethical standards. Question 7. The risk matrix shows a potential for disputes arising from poorly defined contract terms in a residential property sale in Boise, Idaho. A real estate agent is assisting a buyer and seller. Which of the following approaches best ensures the enforceability and clarity of the real estate contract under Idaho law? Option A. Rely on verbal agreements for key terms such as the exact closing date and any specific repairs the seller has agreed to make, as these are often understood between parties. Option B. Thoroughly review and customize a standard Idaho Association of Realtors registered purchase agreement, ensuring all essential elements like property description, price, closing date, earnest money, and all contingencies are clearly and specifically stated in writing, and that both parties understand the terms. Option C. Use a generic online contract template without consulting local real estate professionals or legal counsel, assuming it covers all necessary aspects for an Idaho transaction. Option D. Include broad statements about the property's condition, such as sold as is, without further clarification on any known defects or required disclosures as mandated by Idaho law. Correct answer is B. Thoroughly review and customize a standard Idaho Association of Realtors registered purchase agreement, ensuring all essential elements like property description, price, closing date, earnest money, and all contingencies are clearly and specifically stated in writing, and that both parties understand the terms. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a potential for disputes arising from poorly defined contract terms, which is a common challenge in real estate transactions. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to ensure all agreements are clear, legally sound, and protect the interests of all parties involved, adhering strictly to Idaho's real estate laws. The best approach involves ensuring that all essential elements of a valid real estate contract are present and clearly articulated in writing. This includes a clear offer, acceptance, consideration, legal purpose, and competent parties. Specifically, the agreement should detail the property description, purchase price, closing date, earnest money terms, and any contingencies. This meticulous attention to detail aligns with Idaho's statutory requirements for real estate contracts, promoting enforceability and minimizing ambiguity, thereby preventing potential litigation. An approach that relies on verbal agreements for significant terms, such as the final sale price or closing date, is professionally unacceptable. Idaho law generally requires real estate contracts to be in writing to be enforceable. Idaho Code Section 9-503. Verbal agreements in this context are highly susceptible to misinterpretation, memory lapses, and disputes, failing to meet the legal standard for enforceability and violating ethical obligations to provide clear and binding agreements. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to use a generic, pre-printed contract form without thoroughly reviewing and customizing it to the specific transaction. While forms can be a starting point, they may not adequately address unique aspects of a sale or comply with current Idaho real estate regulations. Failing to tailor the contract can lead to omissions or clauses that are not legally binding or are disadvantageous to one party, creating enforceability issues and potential liability for the agent. Finally, an approach that includes vague or ambiguous language regarding the property's condition or the buyer's financing terms is also problematic. Such ambiguity can lead to disputes over whether conditions have been met, making the contract difficult to enforce and potentially exposing parties to unforeseen liabilities. Professional practice demands clarity and specificity in all contractual clauses to ensure mutual understanding and legal compliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes thoroughness, legal compliance, and clear communication. This involves understanding the specific requirements of Idaho real estate law, carefully drafting or reviewing all contract provisions, ensuring all parties comprehend the terms, and documenting all agreements in writing. When in doubt, consulting with legal counsel is a critical step to ensure the contract is legally sound and enforceable. Question 8. Process analysis reveals a mortgage loan originator in Idaho has received a completed loan application from a prospective borrower who is eager to understand the total estimated closing costs. The originator has a good rapport with the borrower and wants to provide a quick, helpful response. Which of the following actions best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional best practices in Idaho? Option A. Issue a loan estimate to the borrower within 3 business days of receiving the application, detailing estimated loan terms and closing costs. Option B. Provide the borrower with a verbal estimate of closing costs based on current market rates and the borrower's stated financial situation. Option C. Delay issuing the loan estimate until the borrower has selected a specific property and lender to ensure the most accurate figures. Option D. Advise the borrower that they can shop around for better rates after the loan estimate has been issued, implying the initial estimate is flexible. The correct answer is A. Issue a loan estimate to the borrower within 3 business days of receiving the application, detailing estimated loan terms and closing costs. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a mortgage loan originator in Idaho to balance the borrower's immediate need for information with the strict regulatory requirements surrounding the mortgage application process. Misrepresenting information or providing incomplete disclosures can lead to significant legal and ethical repercussions, including potential license suspension or revocation by the Idaho Department of Finance. The originator must ensure all actions align with the Loan Originator Compensation Rule and the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, RESPA, to protect the borrower and maintain professional integrity. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves providing the borrower with the loan estimate within the legally mandated timeframe, typically 3 business days after receiving the borrower's application information. This document is crucial as it outlines the estimated loan terms, monthly payments, and closing costs. The originator must ensure the loan estimate is accurate and reflects the terms discussed, adhering to Idaho's specific disclosure requirements and federal regulations like RESPA. This approach prioritizes transparency and compliance, safeguarding the borrower's understanding and rights. Incorrect approach is analysis. Providing a verbal estimate of closing costs without a formal loan estimate is a regulatory failure. While helpful for initial discussion, it does not satisfy the disclosure requirements of RESPA and Idaho law, which mandate written disclosures within specific timeframes. This can mislead the borrower about the true costs involved. Delaying the issuance of the loan estimate until after the borrower has committed to a specific lender or property is also a violation. The loan estimate must be provided early in the process to allow the borrower to compare offers and make informed decisions, as required by federal regulations. Suggesting that the borrower can shop around for better rates after the loan estimate has been issued, implying that the initial estimate is not binding, is misleading. While borrowers can always seek other offers, the loan estimate provides a baseline for comparison, and significant deviations without proper explanation can be problematic. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. When presented with a borrower's request for information, the first step is to determine what disclosures are legally required and when they must be provided. This involves understanding the application process stages and the associated disclosure timelines. If a borrower expresses interest, initiating the formal application process and providing the required disclosures promptly is paramount. Any information shared verbally should be clearly identified as preliminary and subject to formal disclosure. Professionals should maintain clear, documented communication with borrowers and always err on the side of providing more information and adhering strictly to regulatory timelines. Question 9. During the evaluation of a potential listing in Boise, Idaho, a seller instructs their real estate agent to only market the property to families with young children, stating they believe this demographic would be the best fit. What is the most appropriate course of action for the agent to take? Option A. Subtly steer potential buyers who do not appear to have young children away from the property during showings. Option B. Ignore the seller's discriminatory request and proceed with marketing the property without addressing the issue. Option C. Inform the seller that their request is illegal, but proceed to market the property primarily to families with young children to satisfy the seller's wishes. Option D. Politely decline the seller's request and explain that marketing restrictions based on family status are prohibited under Idaho's Fair Housing Act, offering to market the property broadly to all potential buyers. The correct answer is D. Politely decline the seller's request and explain that marketing restrictions based on family status are prohibited under Idaho's Fair Housing Act, offering to market the property broadly to all potential buyers. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate licensee to navigate potential fair housing violations while attempting to fulfill a client's request. The licensee must balance their fiduciary duty to the client with their legal and ethical obligations under fair housing laws. Careful judgment is required to avoid discriminatory practices, even when seemingly acting on behalf of a client. The best professional approach involves politely but firmly declining the client's discriminatory request and educating them on fair housing laws. This approach directly addresses the problematic nature of the request by refusing to act upon it. It then proactively fulfills the licensee's obligation to uphold fair housing principles by informing the client about the illegality of their preference. This aligns with Idaho's Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination based on protected characteristics and the ethical standards expected of real estate professionals. By educating the client, the licensee attempts to steer them away from discriminatory actions and reinforces the importance of equal housing opportunities. An approach that involves subtly steering potential buyers away from properties based on the client's discriminatory preference is ethically and legally unacceptable. This constitutes indirect discrimination and violates the spirit and letter of fair housing laws. The licensee would be facilitating discriminatory practices, even if not explicitly stating the discriminatory reason to the prospective buyers. Another unacceptable approach is to inform the client that such requests are illegal, but then proceed to fulfill them by selectively showing properties. This creates a dangerous precedent and places the licensee in a position of complicity in discriminatory acts. The licensee's actions would directly contradict their stated understanding of the law and their ethical responsibilities. Finally, an approach that involves ignoring the discriminatory request and proceeding with showings as usual without addressing the issue is also professionally deficient. While it might seem like avoiding conflict, it fails to uphold the licensee's duty to educate the client and prevent potential fair housing violations. This inaction allows the discriminatory sentiment to persist and potentially influence future actions, undermining the principles of fair housing. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Identifying the potential fair housing issue. 2. Consulting relevant laws and regulations. Idaho Fair Housing Act. 3. Prioritizing ethical obligations over client preferences when they conflict with the law. 4. Communicating clearly and professionally with the client, explaining legal boundaries and ethical responsibilities. 5. Documenting all interactions and decisions. Question 10. What factors determine the net annual income a client can expect from investing in a real estate investment trust rate in Idaho, considering a purchase of 500 shares at $1.40 per share, where the rate currently pays a quarterly dividend of $0.75 per share, and assuming Idaho's state income tax rate on dividends is 5%. Option A, dividend yield percentage multiplied by the total investment cost. Option B, the projected annual dividend income plus an estimate of potential capital appreciation without considering taxes. Option C, the projected annual dividend income minus the estimated Idaho state income tax on that dividend income. Option D, the total projected annual dividend income before any tax deductions. The correct answer is C, the projected annual dividend income minus the estimated Idaho state income tax on that dividend income. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate salesperson in Idaho to accurately calculate the potential return on investment for a client considering a rate, while also understanding the specific tax implications relevant to Idaho residents. Miscalculating the return or failing to account for Idaho's tax structure could lead to significant financial detriment for the client and potential professional liability for the salesperson. The salesperson must demonstrate not only an understanding of rate mechanics, but also the practical application of financial calculations and tax awareness within the Idaho context. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves calculating the projected annual dividend income based on the rate current dividend per share and the number of shares purchased, then subtracting the estimated Idaho state income tax on that dividend income to arrive at the net annual return. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the client's primary concern, the actual cash flow they will receive after taxes. Idaho Code Section 63-3022 generally taxes dividend income, and a responsible salesperson must account for this to provide accurate financial advice. This method provides a realistic net return, enabling the client to make a well-informed decision. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply calculate the gross annual dividend income without considering any taxes. This fails to provide the client with a true picture of their net earnings and is misleading, as Idaho residents are subject to state income tax on dividends. This approach violates the ethical duty of full disclosure and the regulatory requirement to provide accurate information to clients. Another incorrect approach is to calculate the total return including potential capital appreciation, but then ignore the state income tax on the dividends. While capital appreciation is a component of total return, the question specifically asks about the income generated by the rate, and dividends are a direct form of income. Ignoring the tax on this income is a significant oversight. A further incorrect approach is to only consider the dividend yield percentage without performing a specific calculation based on the investment amount and current dividend per share. While yield is a useful metric, it doesn't translate directly into a dollar amount of income for the client without further calculation, and it still omits the crucial tax consideration. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize providing clients with accurate net figures that reflect real-world financial outcomes. This involves understanding the client's investment goals, the specific financial instruments involved, and the relevant tax implications within the client's jurisdiction. A decision-making framework should include 1. Clearly identifying the client's objective, e.g., income generation. 2. Understanding the investment vehicle's characteristics, e.g., rate dividend structure. 3. Researching and applying relevant jurisdictional tax laws, e.g., Idaho state income tax on dividends. 4. Performing precise calculations to arrive at a net, actionable figure. 5. Communicating all assumptions and calculations transparently to the client. Question 11. Governance review demonstrates that a potential homebuyer in Idaho has expressed interest in utilizing a government-backed loan program, specifically mentioning FHA, VA, and USDA loans, due to their perceived benefits for first-time buyers. As a licensed real estate salesperson in Idaho, what is the most appropriate course of action to guide this buyer? Option A. Advise the buyer that as a veteran, they can likely waive the appraisal requirements for a VA loan to expedite the process. Option B. Provide general information about the typical features and eligibility considerations for FHA, VA, and USDA loans, emphasizing the importance of consulting with a mortgage lender for specific pre-approval and detailed guidance. Option C. Inform the buyer that USDA loan geographic restrictions are flexible and can be overlooked if the purchase price is attractive. Option D. Assure the buyer that based on their stated income and employment, they will likely qualify for an FHA loan and can proceed with making an offer. The correct answer is B. Provide general information about the typical features and eligibility considerations for FHA, VA, and USDA loans, emphasizing the importance of consulting with a mortgage lender for specific pre-approval and detailed guidance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a real estate salesperson in Idaho to navigate the complexities of government-backed loan programs while ensuring compliance with both federal guidelines and Idaho's specific real estate licensing laws. Misunderstanding or misrepresenting these programs can lead to significant financial harm for consumers, regulatory penalties for the salesperson, and damage to the reputation of the real estate profession. The salesperson must balance client needs with the strict eligibility criteria and disclosure requirements inherent in FHA, VA, and USDA loans. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves thoroughly understanding the eligibility requirements and benefits of FHA, VA, and USDA loans, and then accurately communicating this information to the potential buyer. This includes advising the buyer on the general parameters of these programs, such as down payment requirements, credit score considerations, and property eligibility, without making definitive guarantees or providing financial advice beyond the scope of a real estate license. The salesperson should then encourage the buyer to consult with a qualified mortgage lender who specializes in these government-backed loans to obtain precise pre-approval and understand their specific financial situation. This approach ensures the buyer is well-informed, the salesperson stays within their licensing authority, and the transaction proceeds on a solid foundation of accurate information and professional guidance. This aligns with Idaho's real estate license law, which mandates honesty, integrity, and competence, and prohibits misrepresentation or fraud. Incorrect approach is analysis. Advising the buyer that they will definitely qualify for an FHA loan based solely on a brief conversation about their income and employment is a regulatory failure. Real estate licensees are not authorized to pre-approve loans or guarantee eligibility. This constitutes misrepresentation and potentially unlicensed lending activity, violating Idaho real estate license laws provisions against dishonest practices and acting beyond the scope of one's license. Suggesting that the buyer can easily bypass the VA loan's appraisal requirements because they are a veteran is a severe ethical and regulatory violation. VA loans have specific appraisal and property standards designed to protect both the veteran and the government. Circumventing these requirements is fraudulent and directly contravenes the spirit and letter of VA loan program regulations, as well as Idaho's requirement for licensees to act with integrity. Recommending that the buyer ignore the USDA loan's geographic restrictions and focus only on the purchase price is also a critical error. USDA loans are specifically designed for rural and suburban areas, and geographic eligibility is a fundamental requirement. Misleading a buyer about these restrictions can lead to a failed transaction, financial loss, and a violation of Idaho's real estate license law concerning truthfulness and fair dealing. Professional reasoning. When faced with a client interested in government-backed loans, a real estate professional in Idaho should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes accurate information dissemination, adherence to licensing scope, and client empowerment through professional referrals. The framework involves 1. Identifying the client's interest in specific loan types. 2. Providing general, factual information about the program's typical characteristics and eligibility factors. 3. Clearly stating the limitations of the salesperson's role and advising the client to seek expert advice from a mortgage lender. 4. Facilitating connections with qualified lenders who can provide personalized pre-approval and guidance. 5. Ensuring all communications are truthful, transparent, and avoid making guarantees or promises that cannot be substantiated. Question 12. Governance review demonstrates that a real estate licensee in Idaho is assisting a buyer who is obtaining a mortgage with a down payment of less than 20%. The lender has indicated that private mortgage insurance, PMI, will be required. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensee to ensure compliance and protect the buyer's interests regarding this PMI? Option A. Advise the buyer to seek a loan product that does not require PMI, even if it means accepting a higher interest rate or less favorable loan terms. Option B. Provide the buyer with a clear written explanation of what PMI is, why it is required by the lender, and the conditions under which it can be canceled, referencing relevant federal guidelines. Option C. Inform the buyer that PMI is a mandatory requirement for their loan and that there is nothing further to discuss regarding this insurance. Option D. State that PMI will automatically be removed from the loan once the borrower's equity reaches 80%, without further explanation or verification. The correct answer is B. Provide the buyer with a clear written explanation of what PMI is, why it is required by the lender, and the conditions under which it can be canceled, referencing relevant federal guidelines. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate licensee in Idaho to navigate the complexities of private mortgage insurance, PMI, disclosure requirements while balancing the client's immediate financial concerns with regulatory compliance. The licensee must ensure the borrower fully understands the implications of PMI, especially when it can be canceled, without misrepresenting the terms or creating a false sense of security. The challenge lies in providing accurate, timely, and understandable information that adheres to Idaho's real estate licensing laws and federal regulations governing PMI. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves proactively providing the borrower with clear, written disclosure regarding the PMI, including the conditions under which it can be canceled, as mandated by Idaho law and federal guidelines like the Homeowners Protection Act. This approach prioritizes transparency and informed consent. The licensee should explain that PMI is typically required by lenders for borrowers with less than 20% down payment, and that it can often be removed once the loan-to-value ratio reaches a certain threshold, usually 80%. This detailed explanation, ideally in writing, ensures the borrower is fully aware of their rights and responsibilities concerning PMI, preventing potential future disputes or misunderstandings. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves only mentioning that PMI is required without elaborating on its cancellation provisions. This fails to meet the regulatory obligation to inform borrowers of all relevant aspects of their mortgage, including potential cost savings through PMI cancellation. Creates a misleading impression that PMI is a permanent, unavoidable expense. Another incorrect approach is to suggest that PMI will automatically be removed once the loan reaches a certain equity level, without verifying the specific terms of the loan agreement and the borrower's eligibility for automatic cancellation. This misrepresents federal law and lender policies, which often require the borrower to formally request cancellation or meet specific criteria. A third incorrect approach is to advise the borrower to avoid PMI altogether by suggesting they seek a loan that might have less favorable terms or higher interest rates to circumvent the PMI requirement. This goes beyond the scope of a real estate licensee's advice on mortgage products and could lead to the borrower making a financially suboptimal decision, potentially violating ethical duties to act in the client's best interest. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a framework of proactive disclosure and client education. This involves understanding the relevant regulations, Idaho real estate law and federal consumer protection laws, identifying potential areas of client confusion or financial impact, like PMI, and providing clear, accurate, and comprehensive information in a timely manner. When in doubt about specific mortgage product details, licensees should refer clients to qualified mortgage professionals rather than offering advice that could be misconstrued or inaccurate. The goal is always to empower the client with knowledge to make informed decisions. Question 13. Governance review demonstrates that a real estate licensee in Idaho is discussing mortgage options with a prospective buyer. The buyer is interested in minimizing their initial monthly payments, Which of the following approaches best reflects the licensee's professional obligations and regulatory requirements in Idaho? Option A. Advise the buyer that an interest-only mortgage is the most suitable choice for reducing upfront expenses, without detailing the implications for principal repayment. Option B. Clearly explain the core features, benefits, and risks of fixed-rate, adjustable-rate, and interest-only mortgages, allowing the buyer to make an informed decision based on their financial goals and risk tolerance. Option C. Recommend an adjustable-rate mortgage, highlighting its lower initial interest rate and monthly payment as the best option for minimizing immediate costs. Option D. Strongly advocate for a fixed-rate mortgage as the only secure and responsible option, discouraging exploration of other mortgage types. Correct answer is B. Clearly explain the core features, benefits, and risks of fixed-rate, adjustable-rate, and interest-only mortgages, allowing the buyer to make an informed decision based on their financial goals and risk tolerance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate licensee in Idaho to balance client needs with regulatory compliance when discussing mortgage options. Misrepresenting or failing to adequately explain the implications of different mortgage types can lead to significant financial harm for the client and potential disciplinary action for the licensee. The licensee must demonstrate a thorough understanding of mortgage products and their suitability for different borrower profiles, adhering to Idaho's real estate licensing laws and ethical standards. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves clearly explaining the fundamental differences between fixed-rate, adjustable-rate, and interest-only mortgages, including their respective risks and benefits, without recommending a specific product. This approach empowers the client to make an informed decision by providing objective information about each mortgage type structure, payment stability, and potential for long-term cost variations. This aligns with Idaho's real estate regulations that require licensees to act with honesty, integrity, and competence, and to avoid misrepresentation or concealment of material facts. Providing unbiased information is crucial to fulfilling the fiduciary duty owed to the client. Incorrect approach is analysis. Recommending a specific mortgage type, such as an adjustable-rate mortgage, solely based on its initial lower payment, without a comprehensive discussion of its future payment volatility and potential risks, is professionally unacceptable. This constitutes a failure to act in the client's best interest and could be considered a misrepresentation if the long-term implications are not fully disclosed. Similarly, focusing exclusively on the interest-only feature of a mortgage, without explaining that the principal balance remains unchanged and that future payments will be higher, or suggesting that an interest-only mortgage is universally beneficial for all buyers, is misleading. This omits critical information about the repayment structure and potential financial burden, violating the duty of full disclosure. Promoting a fixed-rate mortgage as the only safe option without acknowledging that other products might be suitable under different circumstances, or without explaining the trade-offs, can also be seen as an oversimplification that limits the client's choices and may not serve their unique financial situation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a client-centered, information-driven approach. This involves first understanding the client's financial situation, goals, and risk tolerance. Then, providing clear, unbiased explanations of all relevant mortgage types, detailing their core mechanics, advantages, disadvantages, and potential long-term impacts. The licensee's role is to educate and facilitate informed decision-making, not to act as a mortgage advisor or lender. Adherence to Idaho's real estate laws, which emphasize honesty, integrity, and competence, is paramount. Question 14. Benchmark analysis indicates that an investor client in Boise, Idaho, is seeking to acquire a distressed property quickly and requires flexible financing terms. The salesperson has identified both hard money loans and seller financing as potential options. Which approach best serves the client's interests and adheres to Idaho's real estate professional standards? Option A. Recommend a hard money loan due to its faster funding capabilities, without extensively detailing its higher costs and shorter repayment terms. Option B. Advise the investor to pursue seller financing, assuming the seller's financial stability, without a detailed assessment of the seller's capacity or the investor's risk management abilities. Option C. Suggest the investor proceed with the financing option that offers the lowest upfront fees, without a comprehensive review of the overall cost and repayment structure. Option D. Thoroughly explain the characteristics, risks, and benefits of both hard money loans and seller financing, and guide the investor to choose the option that best aligns with their financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment goals. The correct answer is D. Thoroughly explain the characteristics, risks, and benefits of both hard money loans and seller financing, and guide the investor to choose the option that best aligns with their financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment goals. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an Idaho real estate salesperson because it requires them to evaluate the suitability of different financing options for a client, balancing the client's immediate needs with long-term financial prudence and adherence to Idaho's real estate licensing laws and ethical standards. Misjudging the appropriateness of a financing method, particularly one as specialized as hard money loans or seller financing, can lead to significant financial harm for the client and potential disciplinary action for the salesperson. The salesperson must demonstrate a thorough understanding of these financing types, their associated risks, and their applicability to different investor profiles and property situations within the Idaho market. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves thoroughly educating the investor on the characteristics, risks, and benefits of both hard money loans and seller financing, and then guiding them to select the option that best aligns with their specific financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment goals. This includes clearly explaining the typically higher interest rates and shorter terms of hard money loans, as well as the potential for more flexible terms, but also the inherent risks of relying on the seller's financial stability in seller financing. The salesperson must ensure the investor fully comprehends these nuances before making a decision, acting as a trusted advisor rather than simply facilitating a transaction. This approach aligns with Idaho's real estate license law, which mandates that licensees act with honesty, integrity, and in the best interest of their clients, requiring them to provide accurate and complete information about all aspects of a transaction, including financing. Incorrect approach is analysis. Recommending a hard money loan solely because it offers faster funding without a comprehensive discussion of its high costs and short repayment period is professionally unsound. This fails to uphold the fiduciary duty to the client by prioritizing speed over financial well-being and potentially exposing the investor to unsustainable debt. Similarly, pushing for seller financing without a detailed assessment of the seller's financial capacity to service the loan or the investor's ability to manage the associated risks, such as potential default by the seller, is negligent. This overlooks the critical due diligence required for such arrangements and could lead to significant legal and financial complications for the investor. Finally, advising the investor to pursue a financing option without fully disclosing all associated fees, interest rates, and repayment schedules, regardless of the loan type, is a direct violation of ethical conduct and Idaho's disclosure requirements, potentially constituting misrepresentation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a client-centric decision-making framework. This involves first understanding the client's financial profile, investment objectives, and risk tolerance. Then, they should present a balanced overview of all viable financing options, detailing the pros and cons of each in the context of the client's specific situation and the current Idaho real estate market. This education empowers the client to make an informed decision. The salesperson's role is to facilitate this informed decision-making process, ensuring all legal and ethical obligations are met, rather than to steer the client towards a particular product for their own convenience or potential commission advantage. Question 15. Benchmark analysis indicates that the Idaho real estate market, like all markets, experiences cyclical fluctuations. A client, considering purchasing a property in Boise, asks you, their licensed Idaho real estate salesperson, for your expert opinion on whether the market is currently at its peak and if they should wait for a downturn before buying. Which of the following approaches best reflects professional and regulatory compliance? Option A. Advise the client that the market is indeed at its peak and recommend they postpone their purchase for at least 6 months, as you predict a significant price drop. Option B. Share your personal belief, based on conversations with other agents, that the market is about to enter a prolonged downturn and suggest they hold off on buying. Option C. Educate the client on the general concept of real estate market cycles in Idaho, referencing publicly available data on historical trends and current indicators, and advise them to consult a financial advisor for personalized investment timing. Option D. Explain that real estate cycles are too unpredictable to be relevant and focus solely on the current asking price of the property they are interested in. The correct answer is C. Educate the client on the general concept of real estate market cycles in Idaho, referencing publicly available data on historical trends and current indicators, and advise them to consult a financial advisor for personalized investment timing. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a real estate salesperson in Idaho to interpret and act upon broad economic indicators without overstepping their professional boundaries or providing unlicensed advice. The salesperson must balance the need to inform clients about market conditions with the prohibition against offering financial or investment advice, which falls outside the scope of a real estate license. Misinterpreting market trends or offering speculative advice can lead to client dissatisfaction, legal repercussions, and disciplinary action from the Idaho Real Estate Commission. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves educating clients about general real estate market cycles and trends in Idaho by referencing publicly available data and reputable industry reports. This includes explaining concepts like expansion, peak, contraction, and trough phases of the market, and how these might influence property values and transaction volumes. The salesperson should then encourage clients to consult with qualified financial advisors or economists for personalized investment strategies or predictions. This approach aligns with Idaho's real estate licensing laws, which permit licensees to discuss market conditions, but strictly prohibit them from offering investment advice or guaranteeing future market performance. It upholds ethical standards by providing relevant information while respecting professional limitations and directing clients to appropriate expertise for financial planning. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves making specific predictions about when the Idaho real estate market will enter a downturn and advising clients to delay purchases or sales based on these personal forecasts. This constitutes providing investment advice and potentially guaranteeing future market performance, which is a direct violation of Idaho Real Estate Commission regulations and ethical practice. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the concept of real estate cycles entirely and focus solely on current listing prices, ignoring broader economic influences that can significantly impact property values and client decisions. This fails to provide clients with a comprehensive understanding of the market and can lead to ill-informed decisions. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to present personal opinions or anecdotal evidence as factual market analysis, without grounding the discussion in objective data or established economic principles. This lacks professionalism and can mislead clients. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Idaho should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes client education within the bounds of their license. This involves staying informed about general market trends through credible sources, understanding the cyclical nature of real estate, and being able to articulate these concepts to clients in a neutral and informative manner. Crucially, professionals must recognize the line between providing market information and offering financial or investment advice. When a client seeks guidance beyond market conditions, such as specific investment strategies or predictions, the professional's responsibility is to refer them to licensed financial professionals. This ensures clients receive accurate and appropriate advice while protecting the salesperson from regulatory violations and ethical breaches. Question 16. The audit findings indicate that a real estate agent in Boise, Idaho, is representing a seller whose property is located near a former industrial site. While the seller has not been directly notified of any contamination, the agent is aware of the site's history and suspects potential environmental concerns could affect the property's value or desirability. What is the most appropriate course of action for the agent to ensure compliance with Idaho's real estate regulations and ethical standards? Option A. Recommend that the seller only disclose potential environmental issues if a buyer specifically inquires about the former industrial site. Option B. Inform the seller that since they have not received direct notification of contamination, no disclosure is legally required regarding the nearby industrial site. Option C. The agent should conduct their own visual inspection of the property to assess the likelihood of environmental contamination and decide on disclosure based on their findings. Option D. Advise the seller to obtain a professional environmental assessment of the property and ensure all findings are disclosed to potential buyers. The correct answer is D. Advise the seller to obtain a professional environmental assessment of the property and ensure all findings are disclosed to potential buyers. Explanation: the audit findings indicate a potential conflict between a real estate agent's duty to their client and the environmental disclosure requirements in Idaho. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the agent's fiduciary duty to secure the best possible outcome for the seller with the legal obligation to disclose known material defects, including environmental hazards, as mandated by Idaho law. Failure to properly disclose can lead to legal liability for the agent and the seller, as well as damage to the agent's reputation and professional standing. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing interests ethically and legally. The best professional practice involves proactively identifying and disclosing any known environmental concerns associated with the property. This approach prioritizes transparency and compliance with Idaho's real estate disclosure laws. Specifically, Idaho law requires sellers to disclose known material defects that affect the property's value or desirability. An agent's duty extends to ensuring these disclosures are made accurately and promptly. By recommending the seller obtain a professional environmental assessment and then disclosing the findings to potential buyers, the agent fulfills their legal and ethical obligations. This approach protects all parties by providing clear information, allowing buyers to make informed decisions, and mitigating potential future liabilities for both the seller and the agent. An approach that involves advising the seller to withhold information about potential environmental contamination until directly asked by a buyer is professionally unacceptable. This failure to proactively disclose known material defects violates Idaho's disclosure statutes and constitutes a breach of the agent's ethical duty of honesty and fair dealing. It creates a significant risk of legal action and financial penalties. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to assume that a previous owner's remediation efforts have fully resolved any environmental issues without verification. While past remediation is relevant, it does not absolve the current seller or their agent from the responsibility of disclosing any known current or past environmental conditions that could impact the property. Relying on assumptions rather than verified information is a failure to exercise due diligence and can lead to undisclosed material defects. Finally, an approach that suggests the agent should personally conduct a visual inspection to determine the likelihood of environmental contamination and then decide whether to disclose based on their own assessment is also professionally unsound. Real estate agents are not qualified environmental inspectors. Their personal opinion on the presence or absence of environmental hazards is not a substitute for professional assessment and can lead to misinformed decisions and potential liability if their assessment is incorrect. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding and adhering to all applicable Idaho real estate laws and regulations, particularly those concerning property disclosures. When faced with potential environmental concerns, the agent's primary responsibility is to ensure full and honest disclosure. This involves encouraging sellers to be transparent, recommending professional assessments when warranted, and facilitating the communication of all material information to potential buyers. Ethical considerations, such as the duty of good faith and fair dealing, must always guide the agent's actions, ensuring that the interests of all parties are considered within the bounds of the law. Question 17. Benchmark analysis indicates that a real estate agent in Boise, Idaho, who is exclusively representing a seller, is approached by a prospective buyer who expresses strong interest in the seller's property. The buyer does not have their own agent. What is the most professionally responsible course of action for the listing agent to take in this situation? Option A. Begin the process of representing both the buyer and seller without explicit disclosure, believing that the agent can manage the competing interests effectively. Option B. Offer advice to the buyer on how to make a competitive offer, subtly guiding them towards terms that might also benefit the seller. Option C. Immediately inform the prospective buyer that the agent represents the seller and advise the buyer to seek their own representation if they wish to have an agent looking out for their interests. Option D. Proceed to show the property and discuss potential offers, assuming the buyer understands the agent's primary loyalty is to the seller. The correct answer is C. Immediately inform the prospective buyer that the agent represents the seller, and advise the buyer to seek their own representation if they wish to have an agent looking out for their interests. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for real estate agents in Idaho, where a potential buyer expresses interest in a property listed by the agent's brokerage, but the buyer is not yet represented by their own agent. The professional challenge lies in balancing the agent's fiduciary duty to their seller with the ethical obligation to avoid misrepresentation, or creating an undisclosed dual agency situation, especially when the buyer might perceive the listing agent as their representative. Careful judgment is required to ensure all parties understand the agent's role and loyalties. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves clearly and promptly disclosing to the prospective buyer that the agent represents the seller, and that the buyer should consider obtaining their own representation. This approach aligns with Idaho's real estate licensing laws and ethical standards, which mandate clear disclosure of agency relationships and prohibit misrepresentation. By informing the buyer of the agent's primary duty to the seller, the agent avoids creating a false impression of representation and upholds their fiduciary responsibilities. This proactive communication ensures transparency and allows the buyer to make an informed decision about how to proceed. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with showing the property and discussing terms without clarifying agency, allowing the buyer to assume the agent is acting in their best interest. This violates Idaho's agency disclosure requirements and can lead to claims of misrepresentation or undisclosed dual agency, breaching the agent's duty to the seller and potentially misleading the buyer. Another incorrect approach is to offer advice to the buyer on pricing or negotiation strategies as if representing them, while still technically being the seller's agent. This constitutes a conflict of interest and a breach of fiduciary duty to the seller, as the agent is providing advice that could potentially harm the seller's position for the benefit of the buyer. A third incorrect approach is to imply that the agent can represent both the buyer and seller equally, without obtaining informed consent from both parties for dual agency, as permitted by Idaho law. This is ethically unsound and legally problematic, as it creates an inherent conflict of interest that cannot be adequately managed without proper disclosure and consent, and may not even be permissible in all circumstances, depending on the specific nature of the advice and representation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should always prioritize clear and upfront communication regarding agency relationships. When a potential buyer approaches an agent who is representing a seller, the agent's first step should be to clarify their role and disclose their fiduciary duty to the seller. This transparency protects both the agent and the parties involved. If the buyer wishes to be represented, they should be advised to seek independent representation. If dual agency is a possibility and permissible, the agent must follow strict Idaho statutory requirements for informed written consent from both parties before proceeding. Question 18. The control framework reveals that a significant new industry is projected to open in a rural Idaho county, potentially leading to a substantial influx of workers and increased demand for housing. As a licensed real estate salesperson in Idaho, how should you advise your client, who is considering selling their property in that county, about the potential impact of this economic development on their property's value? Option A. Inform your client that this economic development will have no significant impact on property values in that specific rural Idaho county. Option B. Urge your client to immediately list their property for sale at the highest possible price, as the economic shift will create a seller's market with no downside risk. Option C. Explain how the increased demand for housing due to the new industry could lead to higher property values, while emphasizing that these are potential impacts and not guarantees, and suggesting further research into local market specifics. Option D. Advise your client that property values are guaranteed to increase by at least 15% within the next year due to the influx of workers. The correct answer is C. Explain how the increased demand for housing due to the new industry could lead to higher property values, while emphasizing that these are potential impacts and not guarantees, and suggesting further research into local market specifics. Explanation. The control framework reveals a scenario where a real estate salesperson in Idaho must advise a client on the potential impact of a significant local economic shift on property values. This is professionally challenging because it requires the salesperson to go beyond simply listing properties and to provide informed insights into market dynamics, which directly affects the client's financial decisions and the salesperson's fiduciary duty. Misinterpreting or misrepresenting these economic factors can lead to significant financial harm for the client and potential legal repercussions for the licensee. Careful judgment is required to balance providing helpful market analysis with avoiding unauthorized practice of financial advising or making guarantees about future market performance. The best approach involves the salesperson leveraging their knowledge of Idaho real estate market trends and general economic principles to explain how the identified economic factor might influence property values, while clearly stating that these are potential impacts and not guarantees. This approach aligns with the Idaho real estate license law and commission rules, which require licensees to act with honesty, integrity, and competence, and to avoid misrepresentation. Specifically, Idaho Code Section 54-208 mandates that licensees shall not be guilty of fraud, misrepresentation, or deceit. By providing a balanced perspective on potential impacts and avoiding definitive predictions, the salesperson upholds their duty to inform without overstepping professional boundaries or making unsubstantiated claims. An approach that involves the salesperson making definitive predictions about the exact percentage increase or decrease in property values based on the economic shift is professionally unacceptable. This constitutes misrepresentation and potentially the unauthorized practice of financial advising, as it goes beyond providing market information to making guarantees about future outcomes, which is beyond the scope of a real estate license and the salesperson's expertise. Such an approach violates the duty of honesty and integrity. Another unacceptable approach is for the salesperson to dismiss the economic factor entirely, stating it has no bearing on property values without conducting any analysis or considering the specific context of the Idaho market. This demonstrates a lack of competence and a failure to uphold the duty to inform the client about factors that could materially affect their real estate transaction. It is a dereliction of the salesperson's responsibility to act in the best interest of their client. Finally, an approach where the salesperson advises the client to immediately sell or buy properties based solely on their interpretation of the economic factor, without considering the client's individual financial situation or long-term goals, is also professionally unsound. This can be seen as steering or undue influence, and it fails to recognize that real estate decisions are personal and should be made in conjunction with comprehensive financial planning, which may involve other professionals. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Identifying the core issue, an economic factor potentially impacting the local real estate market. 2. Assessing the salesperson's role, to inform and advise within the bounds of real estate expertise and licensing. 3. Consulting relevant regulations, Idaho real estate license law and commission rules regarding honesty, competence, and misrepresentation. 4. Analyzing potential impacts, considering how the economic factor might affect supply, demand, and property values in the specific Idaho market. 5. Communicating responsibly, presenting potential impacts as possibilities, not certainties, and avoiding financial advice or guarantees. 6. Prioritizing client interests, ensuring advice is in the client's best interest and does not lead to financial harm. Question 19. The evaluation methodology shows that a real estate salesperson in Idaho is assisting a buyer who is unfamiliar with the mortgage process and expresses a strong preference for a particular type of loan product they heard about from a friend. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Idaho real estate salesperson to take regarding the buyer's financing inquiry? Option A. Explain the general differences between various loan types and strongly recommend the buyer consult with a licensed mortgage broker or loan officer to discuss their specific financial situation and explore suitable options. Option B. Recommend a specific lender and loan product that the salesperson has had positive experiences with in the past, believing it would be a good fit for the buyer. Option C. Ask the buyer detailed questions about their income, employment history, and existing debts to help them determine which loan products they might qualify for. Option D. Inform the buyer that financing is outside the scope of their services and advise them to figure out the financing on their own. The correct answer is A. Explain the general differences between various loan types and strongly recommend the buyer consult with a licensed mortgage broker or loan officer to discuss their specific financial situation and explore suitable options. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that a real estate salesperson in Idaho must understand the nuances of financing to effectively advise clients and comply with Idaho real estate law. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the salesperson to balance client needs with legal and ethical obligations, particularly when a client expresses a preference that might not be in their best financial interest or could lead to regulatory issues. Careful judgment is required to navigate these situations without providing unlicensed financial advice. The best approach involves the salesperson acting as a facilitator and educator, guiding the client towards qualified professionals. This means clearly explaining the different types of financing available and their general implications, while explicitly stating the salesperson's limitations in providing specific financial advice. The salesperson should then recommend that the client consult with a licensed mortgage broker or loan officer to discuss their specific financial situation and explore suitable loan options. This aligns with Idaho's regulatory framework, which prohibits real estate licensees from engaging in activities that require a separate financial services license. By empowering the client to seek expert advice from licensed professionals, the salesperson upholds their duty of care and avoids potential legal and ethical breaches. An incorrect approach involves the salesperson attempting to pre-qualify the buyer by asking detailed questions about their income, debts, and credit history to determine which loan products they might qualify for. This crosses the line into providing financial advice and potentially engaging in activities reserved for licensed mortgage loan originators, which is a violation of Idaho real estate and mortgage lending regulations. Another incorrect approach is for the salesperson to recommend a specific lender or loan product based on their personal experience or a perceived benefit to the client, without the client having first consulted with a qualified mortgage professional. This could be construed as steering or undue influence, and the salesperson may not have the expertise to accurately assess the client's financial capacity or the suitability of the recommended product, potentially leading to a detrimental outcome for the buyer and violating ethical standards of practice. A further incorrect approach is for the salesperson to simply state that they cannot help with financing and disengage from the conversation, leaving the client without any guidance on how to proceed. While avoiding unlicensed advice is crucial, a complete disengagement fails to meet the salesperson's ethical obligation to assist the client in navigating the transaction process to the best of their ability within their scope of practice. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes client education and referral to qualified experts. This involves understanding the boundaries of their license, clearly communicating those boundaries to clients, and proactively identifying opportunities to connect clients with other licensed professionals who can provide specialized services. The focus should always be on facilitating an informed decision by the client, rather than making decisions for them. Question 20. Governance review demonstrates that a licensed real estate salesperson in Idaho has been actively closing multiple transactions throughout the year. The salesperson has not maintained a detailed accounting system, but has a general idea of their earnings. They have bank statements showing deposits and a rough mental tally of commissions. To prepare for tax season, which of the following methods best ensures compliance with Idaho's real estate regulations and federal tax reporting requirements for financial management? Option A. Create a detailed ledger or accounting system that records each commission earned, the date of receipt, the source of the commission, and any associated expenses deducted. Option B. Rely solely on bank statements to track income, assuming all deposits represent commission earnings without further detailed record keeping. Option C. Estimate total commission income at the end of the year based on a general understanding of closed deals and a review of bank deposits. Option D. Record only the net amount received after deducting all personal and business expenses, without separately tracking the gross commission earned. The correct answer is A. Create a detailed ledger or accounting system that records each commission earned, the date of receipt, the source of the commission, and any associated expenses deducted. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for Idaho real estate licensees, accurately tracking and reporting commission income for tax purposes, especially when dealing with multiple transactions and varying payment schedules. The professional challenge lies in ensuring compliance with Idaho's real estate licensing laws and IRS reporting requirements, which mandate precise record-keeping for all financial transactions. Failure to do so can result in penalties, audits, and potential disciplinary action from the Idaho Real Estate Commission. Careful judgment is required to select the most appropriate and compliant method for financial management. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves maintaining a detailed ledger or accounting system that records each commission earned, the date of receipt, the source of the commission, e.g., property address, client name, and any associated expenses deducted. This approach directly aligns with the requirements of Idaho Code Title 54, Chapter 29, which implicitly requires licensees to maintain accurate financial records for their business activities. Furthermore, it facilitates accurate reporting for federal income tax purposes, as required by the IRS, ensuring that all income is accounted for and that deductions are properly documented. This method provides a clear, auditable trail of all financial dealings. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply estimate total commission income at the end of the year based on memory or a general understanding of closed deals. This fails to meet the Idaho Real Estate Commission's implicit record-keeping expectations and the IRS's explicit requirement for substantiation of income. Without specific documentation for each transaction, it becomes impossible to verify the reported income, leading to potential tax discrepancies and penalties. Another incorrect approach is to only record the net amount received after deducting all personal and business expenses, without separately tracking the gross commission earned. This method obscures the actual gross income, which is the basis for tax reporting, and can lead to underreporting of income. Idaho real estate law and IRS regulations require reporting of gross income, with expenses then being itemized and deducted. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on bank statements to track income, without cross-referencing with transaction details. While bank statements show deposits, they do not provide the necessary context for each commission, such as the property, client, or specific transaction it relates to. This lack of detail makes it difficult to reconcile income with actual sales and can lead to errors in reporting, especially if multiple deposits are made on the same day or if funds are commingled. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive and systematic approach to financial management. This involves establishing a clear accounting system from the outset of their real estate career, regularly updating financial records, ideally on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, is crucial. When faced with complex financial situations or significant transactions, consulting with a qualified tax professional or accountant is a wise decision to ensure full compliance with all applicable regulations. The principle of, if it's not documented, it didn't happen, is paramount in financial record-keeping for licensed professionals.